Hi everybody. What I want to do now is to introduce the book International Negotiation in a Complex World by Starkey, Boyer, and Wilkinson, and the framework that this book is using, because we're going to follow it a little bit as we try to better understand negotiations and in the context of international relations. First of all, it is important that you're going to get the fourth edition because the cases that they are using throughout the book are different than the third or second or first edition. So try to get this one. And by now, hopefully you all read at least the first chapter. And you see that this book has several advantages. It's extremely accessible, and it's organized within this framework of the board game. Now, before we go into that in a little bit depth, a few points, general points about negotiations. So, negotiations have been researched in the field of economics and psychology and labor relations and legal field with contracts, of course, and business, and so on and so on and so on. But in the realm of international politics, there is some things that are unique. And this is where it is important, even if you learn negotiations in the past, to try and focus on IR more specifically. There are a lot of things that we are drawing from those different fields and from those different techniques and tools that were developed maybe in economics or business, but there are other things that are unique, more unique to international relations. One thing that we need to ask ourselves is, what is the goal of negotiations in general? And the answer is, negotiations are the way to get to, an agreement, to a peaceful resolution for any dispute or any conflict. And when I say peaceful, it doesn't necessarily mean kumbaya and everybody are friends at the end, but it does mean that there was an agreement that both sides or all sides respect, and they do that without exchanging violence or using direct force. In international relations, sometimes it's just to negotiate with others just means that we have a channel of communication. And that can happen as we exchange hits. So you will see that there are many examples of negotiations that are happening while there is an actual conflict, even an actual war. How do we get to ceasefire agreements? We do that while they are negotiations, while militaries are fighting on the field. And there is a relationship between those. But this is where in international relations and conflict resolution, sometimes negotiations are really important. It's really important to keep the negotiations going because that's the only way to avoid violence or stop violence if violence is already happening. So don't ever shy away from negotiating, even if the other side is threatening to use violence or actually is using violence. So those were a few general points about negotiations in international relations in this context of conflict resolution. Now, if we go back to the book uses the framework of the game board. And the first chapter explains and introduces those different parts. Very briefly, there are 4 parts that I used here. So the first is the board game. The board game is the context of the negotiations. what is going on in the system? How many great powers are there? What is the geography? What are the power relations? Who are allies? Who are foes? What are the transportation options? What are the communication options? Okay. If you go back to your first negotiation exercise between Pendant and Arglu, that was a part that I mostly left out for you. You didn't know how the board was set up, but that is very important. First step of the framework. Then we move up to know the players. Who is playing the negotiation game? How many of them are involved? Are there any consultants, any third parties that are involved? Who are they? Types of government, types of personalities, their experience, etc. So that's what we are discussing when we talk about the players of the board game. Then we move on to the stakes. Are we dealing with an issue of high politics? Is it a border dispute? Or is it a low, what we call low politics? Is it an issue that talk about labor relations? Now, by low politics, I don't mean not important, but I do mean this is not something that countries are willing to go to war over. And so that is a question when we get to talk about the stakes that are involved. What are people willing to do? Are we willing to go all in and use our military, fight and die for the cause, for whatever it is that we're trying to solve here? Or is it just a problem to be solved that in the long term, if it's not going to be dealt with, will be very problematic, but this is not very high stakes? Why is that important? It's important because other things come along with that. How resolve are the sides? Who is involved? Is it high-level political decision makers or low-level bureaucrats? How much freedom do the negotiations have? How much attention does the public pay to what is going on in the negotiation process? So those are the stakes. And then finally, we can talk about the moves, which are the strategy and the tactics of what are we saying? Are we going into brinkmanship? Are we using reciprocity? Are we going to try and con our way into an agreement or be very conciliatory? And so those are the moves, right? And that is the general framework of the book. Then the book introduces at the beginning two cases, one of multilateral large climate change negotiations in the world. And this is a large, complex case with many parties involved, and some of them are nation states, some of them are international negotiations. Even in the more recent definitions of climate change, this would be considered a case of low politics or lower politics. And we are seeing involvement from NGOs, we are seeing involvement from the UN and other international organizations. And so it's a complex case that kind of draws on all parts of the international system. And then the second case that the book is using is the Iranian nuclear deal between the negotiations that took place between 2013 and 2015. And here we're seeing a case with many less parties involved. We have on one side Iran, and on the other side what we call the P5+1, the 5 permanent members of the UN and Germany. And so those could be seen also as multilateral negotiations, but some see them as bilateral because basically there are only two sides here, Iran and everybody else. Although that everybody else front has broken since, but we'll talk about that more in detail. Certainly high stakes, and certainly something that we are willing to go all the way to using force, and Iranians are willing to go and use force for. And so this is a very different case. And those are the two general cases where the book tries to apply the framework to. What we will do in class is use those, but also other cases, some of those case studies that I shared with you, or that we will cover, the case studies from the Georgetown Center for Diplomatic Studies. And so that's it for this one. And so if you haven't gotten the book, make sure you do it as soon as possible and go right into reading the first and second chapters.